Hello and welcome to another video, and in this video we're going to take a break from the Power Armour project and go over something that I don't see mentioned enough about whenever anyone's talking about some form of national service or even a draft in the United Kingdom. And that is all of the medical disqualifications. That means, depending on which study you're looking at, between 60 and 80% of the population cannot serve in the military for medical reasons. This is also a common thing, I think, in Western armies. The US having a recent study saying that 77% of their population is ineligible to serve in the military. Part of this is probably due to overdiagnosis, but then part of it is due to the medical disqualifications that we can now look at on the British Army website. Now, there's obvious disqualifications here, like blood diseases, heart issues, intestinal issues, and things like history of spinal surgery. And before we go further, I do understand that the idea of joining the military is you've got to be a soldier first. However, when we look at other problems that it lists here, like having, say, a history of shoulder issues, a history of knee injuries, a history of back pain, the problem is with that's a massive grey area. And you've got to think that if you've been into fitness, if you've been into any form of sport, how do you get to 21 years old without some form of injury? Particularly, let's say, if you play rugby, how do you get to 21 years old without having some form of back pain or shoulder pain or minor knee injury, even if it is only minor? All of which could disqualify you from actually being able to join the military. Now, it does say these are judged on a case-by-case basis, but when you try and look up the amount of people who applied to get into the military and who were accepted, the number of accepted applicants into the UK Armed Forces is about 10 to 15% of applicants, with 16% of those rejections being on medical grounds alone. So I see people talking about how bad recruitment is and how we need a bigger military. How big of a volunteer fighting force could we actually raise? How big of a draft force could we actually raise? Well, let's work it out, and let's start off with the volunteer force. So the UK currently has a population of 68 million, with of course about 34 million of those being male, and approximately 8.2 million of those being within the fighting ages of 18 to 35. One, I'm going to stick with that number for ease, and two, we're going to add in women later on as well, but it's easier just to keep it to the men for now. Now I'm going to go for kind of a middle point from all the studies and research I did, and basically subtract 70% of that population that can't meet the medical requirements that we just talked about. That leaves us with about 2.46 million men. Now we need to work out how many of those 2.46 million are actually likely to join voluntarily. Of which I want to go for one of the most patriotic times when it comes to joining the military that I can think of, and that is really World War I. You see, conscription didn't start early then, so a lot of the early forces into World War I from 1914 to 1916 were voluntary forces, of which they were able to raise a 1 million-man army of volunteers. The population back then was a lot smaller, it was about 36 million, so when you work out the fraction of the population that was basically fighting age men who could join the military and those who actually volunteered, you end up at about 12.5% of the population of fighting age males. Which does kind of make sense, because that's like 1 in 8 men joining. I do want to just pause at this point in the video and say that when I was trying to research for this video, it was quite difficult to find consistent, accurate data that matched different sources. Even finding the correct population for the United Kingdom in 1914 was difficult, ranging from 36 million to 46 million. I think part of that is because how much of the British Empire accounted into it, how much of the Commonwealth, etc. But either way, even if I'm off by, say, 20% on all of this data, you'll see the trend as the video goes on. However, there is a little bit of an adjustment that we need to make here, because the demographics of the country has changed so much from there. We need to quickly look at the percentage of different ethnicities in the UK population and how that relates to the percentages who willingly join the military now. Now, of those fighting age males, around 81% are white, with about 10% being Asian, typically South Asian, and then about 4.5% being black, with the rest of the percentage being mixed and others. However, the demographics of the UK Armed Forces overall are about 88% white, with actually, if you split it down, the Royal Air Force and the Navy being about 95% white, with Asians being about 6% and black people being about 3.5%, and then mixed being the remainder. Now, basically, long story short, I had to kind of add up all of these numbers to try and get a figure to subtract from that main portion of fighting age males to show an accurate representation of who is actually likely to join and not. of which I came up with the number that I need to subtract another 11% from those fighting age males to level the playing field so that all of the demographics of the country are equally likely to join. Again, this isn't 100% accurate because there's then random figures like 10% of the country is Islamic, but only 0.5% of the military is. But most of those Islamic people are of Asian descent, and there's meant to be 6% of the military being Asian as a total, but yet the population of the country is 10% of Asian, so it kind of doesn't add up. I think the reason for these conflicting numbers is some of the data might be from 2021, some of it's from 2023, some of it's added up over like 5 years and averaged out. But either way, even if I'm a bit wrong on these percentages, either one side or the other, it kind of doesn't make a difference, as I'm sure you'll get the point by the end numbers. So with that 11% subtracted from 2.46 million, you end up with approximately 2,189,000. And now we return back to that World War I figure of 12.5%. So 12.5% of that 2 million is 273,675 men. And now it's time to add the women back into it. So around 12% of the military at the minute is female. So if we add 12% of that 273,000, we get 306,500. That being the total likely volunteer force that the British could raise at the minute. Now, if it wasn't for those medical disqualifications, we'd be up at 1 million, like we were in World War I, but with those medical disqualifications, we're now at 300,000. What about if a draft was initiated, a full conscription? Well, we'll go back to us 8.2 million men. This is much easier to work out. I'm also keeping to 18 to 35, because at least to start with, it's unlikely that they're going to start drafting 40, 50-year-olds, especially as they're going to be dads working in workshops, raising kids. However, those medical disqualifications are likely to be a lot higher because people will be trying to dodge the draft. With a National Health Service as well, I'm pretty sure that doctors will happily sign someone off with a diagnosis so they don't get blown up by a drone in a trench. So I suspect with the current medical disqualifications, you're going to be sitting at about 90%. That being 90% who don't qualify. That takes us immediately down to 820,000 workers, and then you have to think about key workers, people working in factories, people working in the health service, etc. Now, due to the pandemic just happening, we can actually find recent studies that shows how many people were key workers, and you're standing at around 33%. However, let's lower that a little bit because we're talking about 18 to 35. We're not talking about everyone, so let's knock that down to a 25% that they'll be able to get away with. So if we knock that 25% off, then we come up to 615,000 fighting age males. Now, as for women joining, I've kind of had to take a bit of a stab in the dark at this. I'm going to go for about 200,000, which would just take us back up to 800,000. The reason for that is there's going to be a lot of mothers, there's going to be a lot of people raising kids, you've got care workers, you've got nurses, all the rest of it. So there's going to be a lot less women who can actually join the military in a draft scenario. In World War II, there were quite a lot of women joining the military. They just weren't in forward front roles. They were doing things in the auxiliaries. So you'd certainly get a lot of women joining, but it would be a lot less than the men. That bringing our full draft force up to about 800,000 with those current medical disqualifications. With that said, you're probably thinking, well, if it was some World War III scenario, they're just going to get rid of all these medical disqualifications. And you're probably right. They'll certainly get rid of most of them, if not all of them, for at least non-combat roles. Of course, pilots and special forces, they'll always be under this scrutiny. But the problem is, if they would discard all these medical disqualifications in a true time of need, why do they exist in the first place for all roles? So again, not talking about fighter pilots, not talking about special forces. But I used to be a diesel mechanic and I had asthma, and it was never a problem despite the fact I was basically breathing in diesel fumes every day. So the idea that someone who had well-controlled asthma couldn't work on some base somewhere and be a part of the military is nonsense. And again, you might still think, yeah, but you've got to be a soldier first. It's all about that first. You've also got to look at the kind of other side of the coin, kind of the non-military side of the coin, and that is the patriotism. If you are discarding 85-90% of applicants, you're saying to them, you are not fit, you are not worthy to serve the country, you're not worthy to be a part of it. Your grandparents who fought in the Second World War, other family members that joined the military, you can't be a part of that. So in a time where patriotism in the UK is definitely on the floor, my opinion is these in certain scenarios should be eased and people should frankly be given a chance. However, that is also assuming that they actually want people to join the military in the first place, which, despite what you see in the news, despite what you see people talking about national service, see people talking about recruitment issues, if they are rejecting 85% of applicants, then the UK military, frankly, does not want recruits. So with all that said, I hope that was informative for you all. If you are a regular viewer, the robot hand video will be out next week. Was going to be this week's video, but I just haven't quite had a chance to film it all. And then after that, we'll be back on the Power Armor project. So with that said, thank you all very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you haven't, and I hope to see you in the next video.